It was a warm afternoon in a small town, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting golden hues across the quiet streets. The hum of life moved at its usual pace, kids playing, cars driving by, people chatting in the local coffee shop. In the midst of all this, 68-year-old Mildred Roberts, a woman with a reputation as a pillar of the community, made her way to the local grocery store, as she did most days. Mildred had lived here for over 30 years, her roots deeply entwined with the town's history. She'd witnessed its growth, its struggles, and had always been a steady presence. Whether it was offering a comforting word at the local church, organizing charity events, or simply checking in on her neighbors, Mildred was known for her kindness, resilience, and wisdom. She had seen her fair share of hardship in her life. She'd lived through the civil rights movement, the turmoil of the 60s, and the many ups and downs of life. But none of that had made her bitter. Instead, it had fortified her sense of justice and compassion. That afternoon, as she made her way down the sidewalk, a familiar path that she had walked 1,000 times, the air felt heavier. There was an unusual stillness to the street that Mildred couldn't quite put her finger on. As she neared the parking lot of the grocery store, her sense of unease grew. There, in front of the store, stood a group of 5 young men, skinheads, all of them, their faces twisted with disdain. They were leaning against the cars, laughing among themselves, their boots scuffing the pavement. Mildred's eyes narrowed as she recognized them. She had seen these boys around town, always hanging out in groups, always in trouble, but she never expected them to be here, to confront her. Her footsteps slowed, but she didn't stop. She had never been one to back down from a challenge. Mildred had always stood tall, even when the world around her seemed to be falling apart. She had endured the harshness of prejudice and the coldness of indifference, but this moment right here, felt different. As she approached, one of the boys caught sight of her, a sneer curling on his lips. The others followed suit, slowly turning their heads toward her. The tension in the air was palpable. "Well, one of them called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's an old lady like you doing around here? You lost Granny." Mildred didn't flinch. She had heard worse in her lifetime, and these boys, with their juvenile antics and misguided hate, were no different. Still, she could feel the sting of their words, as hollow as they were. She had learned long ago to choose her battles, but there was something about this moment that demanded her attention. "Nothing to see here, boys," she said calmly, her voice steady but firm. "I'm just getting my groceries, same as I do every week." But the leader of the group wasn't satisfied. He took a few steps toward her, his boots echoing loudly against the pavement. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place, huh? You think we're gonna let you go on your merry way?" He spat on the ground in front of her, the gesture meant to provoke. Mildred stood her ground, not backing away, but neither did she raise her voice. "You're not the first to challenge me, and you won't be the last. But I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." The other boys began to laugh, egging him on. "Ooh, Granny's getting brave," one of them mocked. "What's she gonna do? Tell us some story from the 60s about how hard her life was." Mildred didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the animosity radiating off them. But what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that her strength didn't come from her physical stature. It came from decades of resilience, from surviving moments far worse than this. She had seen hate manifest in many forms over the years, but nothing had ever broken her spirit. This moment, these boys, were just another test of that spirit. But then, just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point, Mildred felt a presence beside her. A young voice interrupted the escalating tension. "Hey, leave her alone." Mildred turned her head to see a teenage boy, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, stepping toward them. He was tall, gangly, and had the unmistakable air of someone who didn't quite belong in the world he was trying to navigate. He wasn't one of the skinheads, But he wasn't exactly a hero either. Mildred didn't recognize him, but she knew his face. He was a local kid, someone who had been in and out of trouble with the law. He had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. The skinhead leader shot him a sharp look, his eyes narrowing with hostility. "What's it to you, kid?" he sneered. The boy didn't back down. "It's not right what you're doing. You can't just mess with people like that." The words hung in the air for a moment, a challenge and a plea, but the leader of the skinheads only chuckled. "You're going to protect this old lady. You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you should know that's not enough to stop us." Mildred's heart raced as she watched the standoff between the two. She had lived through times when standing up for what was right had come at a much higher cost. But now, with the situation escalating, she felt a flicker of something else. Could this boy, this unlikely ally, really help her? Would he stay, or would he fold like so many before him? And just as the boy seemed ready to confront the group further, one of the other skinheads moved forward, a menacing grin on his face. "Better watch out, kid. You don't know who you're dealing with." The boy stood firm, and for a brief moment, Mildred thought the situation might just resolve itself. But then the skinhead leader stepped forward again, his eyes glinting with a dangerous determination. "Get out of here," he barked at the boy, "unless you want to get hurt." Mildred could feel the weight of the situation shifting, the line between confrontation and violence growing ever thinner. Her heart pounded, and she knew the time had come to act. But how? How could she, a woman in her late 60s, stop this from escalating? With one last glance at the boy, who stood tall beside her, Mildred made a decision. It was time to take control of the moment. "You think you're tough," she said, her voice suddenly loud and commanding. "You think I'm scared of you." The skinhead leader stepped back, clearly taken aback. "What are you talking about?" Mildred smiled, though it was a smile of resolve, not humor. "I've seen worse than you. You don't scare me, and you don't scare anyone else. You'll leave here, and you'll think twice next time before you pick on someone weaker than you." The boy looked at her, surprised, but there was a new light in his eyes. And for the first time, the skinhead group hesitated, unsure of what to do next. This wasn't just another ordinary day in Mildred's life. This was a turning point, a moment that would lead her down a path of change, not just for herself, but for the community she had given so much of her life to. Little did she know, this moment would soon ripple through the town, altering its course in ways no one could predict. But for now, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Mildred stood her ground, unshaken. The air felt thick with tension as the group of skinheads hesitated, looking at Mildred as though they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The boy beside her was still standing, arms at his sides, his body tense, as though he expected the situation to explode at any moment. The skinhead leader took a step back, eyeing the boy and then Mildred, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. "You've got guts, lady," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "But don't think for a second we'll let you talk down to us." Mildred's heart raced as the group lingered, their glares sharp, but something in the way she stood her ground seemed to have taken the wind out of their sails. They had expected fear, maybe even compliance, but they hadn't found it in her. She was an old woman, certainly, frail in appearance, perhaps, but there was nothing about her that was willing to be intimidated. The silence stretched on for several long moments, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustling of the wind. For Mildred, it was a test, a moment that could determine much more than just her own fate. It was a test for the young boy beside her, a test for the town, and perhaps even for herself. What would it take to break the cycle of hatred and violence that had been slowly festering in the town for years? And who would have the courage to confront it head-on? Suddenly, the leader of the group smirked, his face contorting in mock amusement. "We don't need this," he muttered to his group, signaling to the others. "Let's go." It wasn't a victory for Mildred, not yet anyway, but it was a momentary win, a brief respite. The group of skinheads began to disperse, their angry muttering slowly fading as they retreated toward their cars, leaving Mildred and the boy alone in the parking lot. Mildred exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline of the moment left her. She turned to the boy, who was still standing beside her, watching the retreating figures of the skinheads with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice softening as she took in the young man's tense posture. He nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Yeah, I'm fine. But you really stood up to them." His voice was still a little shaky, but there was a hint of admiration in it now. "I didn't think you had it in you." Mildred couldn't help but smile, though it was a tired smile, one that spoke of years of struggles and lessons learned. "I've had to stand up to worse than them. Son, you don't get to be my age without learning a few things about courage." She paused, glancing at the parking lot where the skinheads had just been. "But I didn't do it alone. You stood with me, and that made all the difference." The boy shifted uncomfortably, but gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought they were going to hurt you." "You did the right thing," Mildred said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes standing up for someone else is the bravest thing you can do." The boy seemed to consider this for a moment, and then, with a shaky breath, he offered her a genuine smile. "Thanks. I don't think anyone's ever said that to me before." Mildred's heart tightened. The boy, she had seen him around town before, though she couldn't quite remember his name, had always seemed to be in trouble, caught in a world that didn't know how to handle them. She had heard the rumors, of course, about his run-ins with the law, about his troubled family. But what the world failed to see was that behind the hardened exterior, there was a kid just trying to find his way, just trying to make sense of a world that had too often thrown obstacles in his path. "I'm Mildred, by the way," she said, giving him a warm smile. "And you are?" The boy hesitated for a moment before offering a small shrug. "Luke," he said, his voice soft. "Luke Taylor." "Nice to meet you, Luke," Mildred said, her tone sincere. "I don't know if you know this, but you've got something special inside you. You stood up for what was right today, and that's worth something." Luke's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something else, something that wasn't anger or defiance, but something softer. It was the first time she had seen him like this, without the usual walls and masks. "You think so?" he asked quietly. "I know so," Mildred replied, giving him a steady look. "You've got more courage than you think. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Luke looked down at the ground, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I don't know. I mess up a lot. I've made some bad choices." "We all have, Luke," Mildred said gently. "But it's not about the mistakes you've made. It's about what you do after. You can always choose to do better." For a moment, there was a stillness between them, a connection that went beyond the confrontation they had just endured. Mildred felt a sense of hope stir within her, a feeling that had been all but extinguished by years of witnessing violence and hatred. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could be the beginning of something new. Maybe, for once, someone was listening. The silence was broken by the sound of tires screeching in the distance, and Mildred turned her gaze to the road, where the skinheads' cars were disappearing into the horizon. They had gone for now, but she knew they would return. There was no mistaking the sense of menace that still lingered in the air. But for the first time, she felt a small flicker of optimism. Maybe there was a chance to change things, to make her town a place where people stood up for each other, where courage could be more than just a fleeting moment. Luke, still standing beside her, seemed lost in thought. His hands were still in his pockets, his face a mixture of uncertainty and curiosity. "You think I could? You think I could make a difference?" he asked quietly, almost as though he was asking himself as much as her. Mildred smiled, her eyes soft with the wisdom of someone who had lived through both the darkest and brightest moments of life. "I know you can. But first, you've got to believe in yourself. You've got to know that you have the power to change." Luke stood there, processing her words, There was something in the air now, a shift in the energy, a glimmer of something brighter. Mildred knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Not for her, not for Luke, not for anyone. But perhaps, just perhaps, this moment would become the catalyst for a greater change. A change that started with a few simple words and a single act of courage. With a deep breath, Mildred gave Luke a final nod. "Take care of yourself, Luke. I'll see you around." As she turned to walk toward the store, her heart was heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. But there was also a quiet hope. This was just the beginning. The days that followed the confrontation at the parking lot were strange for Mildred. She couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind, thinking about how close things had come to escalating further. The image of those skinheads surrounding her, the rage in their eyes, and the anger in their voices still haunted her. But in a strange way, it had also emboldened her. She had faced down a threat, something she never thought she'd have to do again at her age, and had come out of it not only unscathed, but with something much more significant. A connection. A bond had formed between her and Luke, though neither of them fully realized just how transformative it would become. It wasn't long before she saw Luke again. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where time seemed to stretch and slow, the world taking on a peaceful, almost nostalgic tone. Mildred was sitting on the porch of her small home, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, the scent of fresh flowers drifting through the air. She had just finished reading her book when she noticed him. Luke was standing across the street, looking at the ground as he walked slowly, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He didn't seem to notice her at first, but as if on some unspoken cue, his eyes flicked up and locked with hers. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether he should approach, then walked across the street, a hesitant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. When he reached the porch, he stopped, shifting uncomfortably from one foot to the other. "Hey," he said, his voice a little unsure, but warm. I've been thinking about what you said the other day." Mildred put her tea down and motioned for him to sit. "You've been thinking about a lot of things, haven't you?" she asked, her tone gentle, but full of understanding. She could see the weight of the world still resting on his shoulders, but there was something different about him now, something more open, more willing to listen. Luke sat down slowly on the porch step, his hands still in his pockets. He looked out over the yard, watching the trees sway in the breeze, as though searching for the right words. "I don't know," he muttered. "It's just, I've been stuck in this thing, you know. Like I don't know what I'm supposed to do, or if I even matter." Mildred studied him, her eyes sharp with the wisdom only years of living could bring. "We all feel that way sometimes," she said softly. "Like the world's got its back turned to you, and nothing you do really matters. But that's not the whole story, Luke. You matter, whether you believe it or not." Luke shook his head, the frustration clear on his face. "I don't know how to believe that, though. I mean, everything I've ever done, everything I've been a part of, it just feels like one big mess. I've messed up so many times, and now I'm just lost." Mildred leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap, her eyes never leaving his. "You're not lost, Luke. You're just still looking for your path. And that's okay. We all go through that. But you're not alone in it. You've got more strength than you think." Luke's brow furrowed. "You really think so?" "I know so," Mildred replied, her voice steady. "The fact that you're here right now, talking to me instead of running away or hiding, it means something. It means you're ready to change, and that's the hardest part." He looked down at the ground, his lips pressed together as he processed her words. Mildred could tell that he wasn't just hearing her, but really thinking about what she was saying, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, though it was faint. "I don't even know where to start," Luke admitted, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I don't know what to do." Mildred smiled, her gaze softening as she stood up and walked over to him. "You don't have to know everything right now," she said. All you need is the courage to take the first step. The rest will come. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the only sounds being the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hum of the neighborhood. Mildred could tell that Luke was processing everything she had said, and though it wasn't going to be easy, she knew that this moment, this conversation, was the beginning of something important. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, Mildred stood and stretched, feeling the weariness in her bones. "Why don't you come by tomorrow? I'm making dinner, and you're welcome to join me. Maybe we can talk some more, help you figure things out." Luke looked up at her, a mixture of surprise and gratitude on his face. I'd like that. Thanks, Mildred." She smiled and patted him gently on the shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Luke. You just have to keep going." The next day, Luke did come by. He was quieter than usual, but the conversation flowed easily between them as they ate together at her modest kitchen table. They talked about everything, about his past, his dreams, and the struggles he faced. Mildred listened patiently, offering advice when she could, but mostly just being there, providing a safe space for Luke to be vulnerable. It was during one of these conversations, as they sat together over dinner, that something inside Luke seemed to click. He looked up from his plate, his eyes a little brighter than before. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about how it's never too late to change. Maybe I've been looking at it all wrong." Mildred smiled, her heart lifting at the sight of his newfound openness. "Sometimes, all it takes is a shift in perspective. Luke, you've got everything you need inside of you. You just have to believe in it." "I think I'm starting to," Luke said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm ready to try." And for the first time in a long while, Mildred felt a sense of peace settle over her. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Luke, that the scars of his past wouldn't just disappear, but there was hope now. Real hope. The days that followed Luke's decision to turn things around were a blend of small victories and quiet realizations. He didn't wake up one morning suddenly transformed. There were no sweeping changes, no grand gestures, but there was something undeniable about his shift. It was the little things that counted. He started showing up more often, sitting with Mildred in the evenings, talking about his life in a way he hadn't before. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the layers of bitterness and anger that had once surrounded him began to peel away. Mildred was there for him every step of the way. She wasn't a miracle worker, but what she offered wasn't something that could be measured in grand successes. It was patience, understanding, and a steady hand to guide him through his own internal battles. They spent hours talking about the past, not to relive old wounds, but to understand the root of the pain. She never judged him for the mistakes he had made, never asked him to justify his actions. Instead, she listened, deeply, compassionately, and through that, Luke began to hear himself in a way he never had before. One afternoon, about a month after their first real conversation, Luke came to her with a piece of news. He had applied for a job at a local auto shop, a place where he had once used his skills as a mechanic to help a few of his friends. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was work, honest, steady work, and it gave him something he hadn't had in a long time, a purpose. When he told Mildred, there was a quiet pride in his eyes, a sense of accomplishment that she could see reflected in his posture. This was a pivotal moment for him, a small but significant step towards regaining control of his life. "Guess what?" he said, his voice barely containing the excitement. "I got the job. Starting Monday." Mildred smiled, her heart swelling with pride for him. "That's wonderful, Luke. I'm so proud of you." He looked down for a moment, as if unsure whether he truly deserved her praise. "I don't know if I deserve it," he murmured, "but it feels like a good start. Like, I'm not completely lost anymore." "No one is completely lost," Mildred replied, her voice warm and firm. "Sometimes, we just have to take that first step, And then the rest of the journey becomes clearer. In the following weeks, Mildred watched as Luke settled into his new routine. He woke up early, worked hard, and came home each evening with a quiet satisfaction that she had never seen in him before. There was still the occasional storm cloud that passed through his mind, the remnants of his troubled past, but he was learning how to face them, how to push through the dark moments instead of succumbing to them. And every time he made progress, however small, it felt like a triumph. But as much as Luke was growing, the world around him hadn't changed. The same neighborhood, the same challenges, the same reminders of where he came from. These things didn't go away overnight. Mildred knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth for him. There would be people who doubted him, who tried to pull him back into old habits, but she also knew that Luke had something inside him now that he hadn't had before. Resilience. It wasn't a given, but it was there, a flickering flame that could grow if he tended to it. One evening after a long day at the shop, Luke walked into Mildred's house, looking more worn than usual. His eyes were tired, and his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world was pressing on him. He collapsed into the chair across from her, sighing deeply as he massaged the back of his neck. "Long day?" Mildred asked, offering him a warm cup of tea. "Yeah," Luke said, rubbing his temples. "It's just, sometimes I feel like it's never enough. Like I'm working so hard, but there's always something that tries to pull me back. I mean, the guys at the shop, they're nice enough, but sometimes it feels like I'm just one bad decision away from losing it all." Mildred sat down beside him, her voice soft but strong. "You're doing great, Luke. It's hard to see the progress when you're in the middle of it. But trust me, what you're doing matters. Every choice you make now is a step forward. And those steps, no matter how small, add up." Luke looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't know how you do it, Mildred. You always seem so calm. Like, no matter what happens, you just know things are going to be okay." Mildred smiled, though it was bittersweet. "I've lived a lot of years, Luke. I've learned that life is never just one thing, never just good or bad. It's a mix of both. But what matters is how you respond. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you choose to move forward." Luke nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through her words. For a long time, he had been trapped in the notion that his past had defined him, that the mistakes he had made were chains he couldn't break. But now, he was beginning to understand that those mistakes didn't have to hold him forever. He could choose to define himself by the decisions he made today, not the ones he had made in the past. "I think I get it," he said quietly. "It's not about running from my past. It's about moving forward, even if I don't have all the answers yet." Mildred nodded, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "Exactly. And that's something that no one can take away from you." The more Luke talked, the more she could see the transformation in him, a slow but steady shift in his perspective. He wasn't the same person who had walked through her door months ago, angry, lost, and bitter. He was someone different now, someone with hope, someone who was beginning to believe in himself. And as much as Mildred had helped him along the way, she realized that it was Luke who had done the hard work. He had chosen to change, chosen to face his demons head-on. And that was something no one could ever take away from him. But even as he grew, a part of Mildred knew that Luke's journey was far from over. There would be setbacks. There would be moments of doubt, of temptation, and of fear. But Mildred also knew that Luke had something deeper now, something stronger than before. He had faith in himself, and that faith would carry him through the storms ahead. The two of them sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their tea, watching the fading light of the evening outside. And though the future was uncertain, Mildred knew that the one thing that could never be taken away from them was this: they had each other. They had built something meaningful, a connection that, despite everything, had endured. And that, she realized, was enough to keep going, no matter what the world might throw their way. And that, she realized, was all any of them needed to make a difference. As the months passed, Luke's life slowly transformed. It wasn't a dramatic change, no sweeping redemption arc, but the steady progress was undeniable. Each day, he showed up for work at the auto shop, a place that had once felt like a dead end, but now felt like a lifeline. He worked hard, not just for the paycheck, but for something deeper, a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. His hands were calloused from hours of labor, but his spirit was softer, more open than it had been in a long time. There were still rough days, moments when the weight of his past would creep in, but he was learning how to deal with them, how to push through, how to make better choices. Mildred noticed the subtle changes in him. His smile was warmer, his voice steadier, his posture more confident. It was as though he was finally standing tall again, not just physically, but emotionally. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of the shop, Luke sat down on Mildred's porch, looking out at the quiet neighborhood street. The air was warm, and the evening sun cast a golden glow over everything. He had been thinking about his past a lot lately, about the times he had been angry and reckless, the years he had wasted. It was hard to escape the shadow of those memories, but for the first time, he didn't feel like they defined him anymore. He was more than his mistakes. "I was thinking," Luke said, his voice quiet but determined, "about everything I've done, everything I've been through. I used to think that what happened to me, that was just it. Like there was no way out of it, you know." Mildred, who had been sitting beside him, nodded slowly. She didn't need to say anything. She had always known that Luke had the potential for change. He just had to believe in himself. "But I'm starting to see it differently now," he continued, looking out at the sunset. "It's not about running from my past or pretending it never happened. It's about owning it, accepting it, and deciding that I'm not going to let it control me anymore. I'm not the same person I was a year ago. I'm not even the same person I was a month ago." He paused, turning to Mildred, his eyes filled with sincerity. "And that's thanks to you. I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't just been there." Mildred smiled softly, but there was no hint of pride in her expression. She knew that Luke had done the hard work. She had only given him the space to begin that journey. "I didn't do anything special. Luke, you did all the hard work. You've always had the strength within you. You just had to find it." Luke looked down at his hands, still rough from the work he did every day. "It's weird. I never thought I could get to this point. Some days, it felt like I was stuck in a hole, and there was no way out. But now, I feel like I'm climbing, you know. Like I'm building something. I don't have it all figured out, but I know I'm on the right path." His words hung in the air between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if they were both giving weight to the gravity of what had happened, to the quiet victory of overcoming so much. As time passed, Luke's journey was tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Old friends who had once been a part of his life, the ones who encouraged his bad habits and led him down darker paths, came back into his orbit. They didn't mean to tempt him, but their presence was a reminder of where he had been and where he could easily slip back into. One afternoon, one of these old friends, Chris, showed up at the auto shop, leaning against the hood of a car Luke was working on. "Hey, man," Chris greeted him, a grin plastered on his face. "Long time no see. Heard you were working here now. You doing all right?" Luke wiped his hands on a rag, taking a moment to assess his old friend. Chris hadn't changed much. He still had that wild, reckless energy about him. The same energy that had once lured Luke into his worst decisions. For a split second, Luke felt a twinge of old familiarity, a pull to slip back into the chaos of their past, but he shook it off, focusing on the work in front of him. "Yeah, I'm good," Luke said, his voice steady. "Things have changed, man. I'm different now." Chris raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Different? You sure? 'Cause, you know, the old Luke would have jumped at the chance to hang out, party a little. You sure you don't miss it?" Luke met his gaze with a calm certainty. "I don't miss it, Chris. I've learned that I don't need to go back there to be happy." Chris looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, then shook his head with a chuckle. "Man, you've changed." "Yeah," Luke agreed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I guess I have." The conversation was brief, and after a few more words, Chris left, disappearing back into the world from which Luke had distanced himself. But that moment lingered. It was a reminder of just how far he had come, and just how easily he could fall back into old patterns if he wasn't careful. Mildred had always warned him about those temptations, about the people who would try to pull him back into his old life. "You can't control others, Luke," she had said, "but you can control your choices. Don't let anyone take away what you've worked so hard for." That afternoon, as Luke sat down for dinner with Mildred, he reflected on the encounter with Chris. It felt good to walk away from it, he admitted, taking a bite of his food. "I didn't feel the pull like I used to." Mildred smiled warmly. "That's the real test, Luke, not running from the past, but making the choice to move forward when it calls to you." A week later, Luke received a call from the owner of the auto shop. He had been offered a promotion. It wasn't a huge leap, but it was a sign that his work was being noticed, that he was being recognized for the man he was becoming. He hung up the phone, his heart racing with a mix of disbelief and pride. "I got it," he said to Mildred, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "They offered me a promotion." Mildred's eyes sparkled with pride. "I knew you could do it." Luke's journey wasn't over, but in that moment, he realized something important. He was no longer the man he had been. He was no longer defined by his mistakes, his failures, or his past. He was defined by the choices he made today, and by the strength it took to move forward, no matter how difficult it was. The world around him hadn't changed. There were still challenges, still people who didn't believe in him, still temptations to face. But Luke had changed, and that, in itself, was a victory. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, he didn't need it to be. He had faith in himself, in the progress he had made, and in the future he was building. And that was enough to keep moving forward. Months went by, and Luke's life continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The auto shop had become more than just a job. It was a sanctuary of sorts. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about fixing himself. The sense of accomplishment he found in his work had slowly healed the wounds he carried for so long. The friendships he built there, honest and grounded, were a stark contrast to the toxic relationships that had defined his past. Luke was no longer the aimless, angry young man who had walked into Mildred's life. He was becoming someone he could be proud of. As his relationship with Mildred deepened, the bond between them shifted. It had always been one of mutual respect, but now there was an added layer of understanding. Mildred had seen the worst of Luke, but she was also witnessing his transformation. She wasn't blind to the challenges he still faced. There were days when the weight of his past would creep in, threatening to pull him down. But those days were becoming fewer, and when they did come, he faced them head-on, determined not to let them define him. One evening, after a long day of work, Luke was sitting with Mildred on her porch, the sun setting in a brilliant blaze of orange and pink. It was a peaceful moment, and for the first time in a long while, Luke felt a sense of contentment settle deep within him. He had come so far from the angry young man who had once walked the streets with nothing but resentment. "I never thought I'd get here," Luke said quietly, staring out at the horizon. "There was a time when I thought I'd be stuck in that same place forever." Mildred looked at him, her expression warm but knowing. "I think you've always had the potential to get here, Luke," she replied gently. "It was just a matter of finding your way." Luke took a deep breath, his thoughts turning inward. "Yeah, but I don't think I could have done it alone. Not without you. You gave me a chance when no one else would have. You didn't just show me a way out. You showed me that I was worth something." Mildred smiled softly, but there was no pride in her smile. She had simply believed in him, and that belief had fueled his transformation. "You did all the hard work, Luke," she said. "I just gave you the space to believe in yourself." But despite her modesty, Luke knew that Mildred had done more than that. She had become the rock he had needed when his foundation was crumbling. She had been the one to remind him that there was always more to him than his mistakes, that he was capable of greatness, even when he couldn't see it. One evening, as he was finishing up a shift at the auto shop, Luke received a call from his old friend Chris. The tone was different this time, less casual, more urgent. "Hey man, can we talk?" Chris's voice was low, almost hesitant. "I need some advice." Luke paused, surprised by the sudden seriousness in Chris's tone. "Yeah, of course," Luke replied. "What's going on?" Chris took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm in a mess, man. I've been making some bad decisions, and now things are getting out of hand. I don't know what to do." Luke felt a pang of sympathy. He remembered those days, the days when he, too, had been lost, without a clue how to climb out of the hole he'd dug. "What kind of mess?" Luke asked. "What happened?" Chris hesitated again, but then he spoke, his voice filled with regret. "I've been hanging out with some old friends, the same crowd that got me into trouble before. And now I'm doing things I swore I'd never do again. I'm scared, man. I don't know if I can get out of it this time." Luke's heart went out to him. He knew all too well what it was like to feel trapped by your past, to think there was no way out. But now, Luke had a different perspective. He had a way out, and he wanted to share that with Chris. "Listen to me, Chris," Luke said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I've been where you are. I felt like I was stuck, like there was no way out of the mess I made. But there is a way out. You just have to choose to take it. You don't have to keep running with those people, man. You can walk away. You don't have to go back to that life." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Luke could hear Chris's breathing, slow and unsure. Finally, Chris spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can do it, Luke. It feels like everything is falling apart." Luke's heart ached for him, but he didn't waver. "You can do it, Chris. I know you can. It won't be easy, but you don't have to do it alone. You've got people who care about you. I care about you." Chris sniffled, and Luke could hear the emotion in his voice. "I don't deserve your help, man. After everything I've done." Luke's voice softened. "You deserve help. We all do. And I'm here for you. But you've got to make the choice. You've got to choose to walk away from the things that are holding you back." After a long pause, Chris finally spoke again, his voice a little stronger. "I'll think about it. I'm not sure what the next step is yet, but I'll think about it." Luke nodded, a sense of peace settling in his chest. He couldn't make Chris's decisions for him, but he could offer him the same chance that Mildred had given him, a chance to believe in himself and make a change. In the weeks that followed, Chris slowly started pulling away from the toxic influences in his life. It wasn't an easy road for him. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but with Luke's guidance, he began to rebuild. It was a slow process, but it was progress. As for Luke, his life continued to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was promoted again at the auto shop, taking on more responsibility and earning the respect of his colleagues. He and Mildred continued to share a quiet, unspoken bond, a bond built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. But the biggest change came when Luke realized that he had found something he had been searching for all his life: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding challenges, but the kind that came from facing them head-on, knowing that he had the strength to overcome whatever life threw at him. Luke was no longer defined by his past. He was defined by his actions, his choices, and his willingness to keep moving forward. And in that, he had found his freedom.